Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome yet again to the next interview in the series, Iowa Prison Perspectives. As you know, if you have been here before, and if you haven't been here before, let me explain to you that this is a collaboration between the Iowa Justice Action Network, Iowa Cure, and Living Beyond the Bars as an effort to inform you, the public, about the prison system and the criminal justice system in Iowa. We are now opening it up also to include information from other states. Up to this point, it has been pretty specifically people who have been incarcerated, people who love someone who's incarcerated, people who have worked in the criminal justice system, and advocates. We are now also going to be interviewing people who have specific information from their profession about crime, about different kinds of punishment, about mental health, about lengthy crime, about a variety of different topics that apply to the prison system and that apply to the criminal justice system. But they are not people who necessarily have been affiliated with the criminal justice system. And we are also going to continue to include the populations that I mentioned before. So we're opening it up a bit. I've had several people who really would like to know what's going on in other states as well as what's going on in Iowa so that they have something to think about in comparison and possibly find ways to generate some action and engage in some action about what Iowa could be doing and maybe what we ought to be doing more of. So today we are very, very fortunate to hear from a professor, retired professor from the University of Northern Iowa in Cedar Falls. His name is Al Hayes. You have met him before. He was interviewed one other time. In addition to being a retired professor, he's also the co-chair of the Iowa Justice Action Network. He has extensive experience in research and in teaching and in sharing information about a variety of subjects, one of which is crime, one of which is mass incarceration, and one of which is the war on drugs. And so today he's going to be sharing information with you about crime, some of the facts and some of the reality about crime, not only in Iowa, but in this country. We hear so much on the news on a regular basis about how horrible crime is, about how crime is rising, about how we're not safe, about how things are just deteriorating. And while there is some truth in that there are pockets and places where, and there are horrible things happening, it is not nearly as bad as the fair people would want you to believe and present it. So I felt like it was a good idea to present some actual statistical information and some research information, a lot of it taken from the Sentencing Project, about what is really happening in the country regarding crime and the crime rates and the kinds of crime. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Hayes and let him give you some factual information, which you are certainly free to research yourself if you're interested in looking it up on the Sentencing Project's webpage or the Vera Institute's webpage. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Al, and it's all yours.
Well, thanks, Sue. I'm glad to be able to talk about this because, as you say, uh, there's a lot of I think misinformation out there. Obviously, uh, people have legitimate fears about public safety. Though, being the victim of a violent crime is one of the worst things that can happen to you. And I think politicians like to play on those fears. There's also a racial component in it. If people are fearful or distrustful of people of a different race, then attributing various kinds of criminal activity to people of different races is one way that the racial divide is increased. We've seen gross examples of manipulation, like the famous Willie Horton ad that was done against Michael Dukakis in 1988, where it suggested that Dukakis was letting violent criminals out, and was really a gross distortion, and helped the first President Bush win his election. And we're seeing the same thing with uh, former President Trump talking about how bad crime has gotten. The first thing to understand is that measuring crime is not like measuring rainfall. You can put a rain gauge in the backyard and it'll pick up how much rain has fallen. And most people who look at the rain gauge could agree, yeah, there's an inch of rain in the rain gauge, and that's how much rain we had. Although of course it's localized. But anyway, so crime is not like that because first of all, you have to agree on what is a crime. Secondly, for most measures, the crime has to be reported. And and third, police departments and others have to decide how to then report crime reports to the national database, which is maintained by the FBI. Well, there's a lot of room for subjectivity in all that. The police get to uh, define what they've people arrested according to different levels of criminality, and they may have an incentive either to underreport or overreport crime depending on what their political agenda is. So we don't want to see that there's this measure of crime that's somehow objective and independent from uh, uh, now basically from we had in this country a spike in violent crime and violent crime victimization in the early 90s. Crime had increased rapidly over the last decade before that. And that led to a lot of the extreme incarceration and punitive measures that we have in place now. So there was a real increase at that time. But since the early to mid 1990s, overall, there's been a steady decrease in reported crime, and and that has continued. Now, what happened was largely due to the pandemic. Some of the normal social controls, I think, were lifted, and people were isolated, and this led to an increase in violent crime, a fairly rapid increase over a couple of years pattern. And of course, that reignited fears of violent crime. Um, Actually, of course, even with the increased levels, it wasn't anywhere near what we'd had in the 1990s. This crime overall was still much lower than it had been, 30 years before. Um, However, as the pandemic has waned and things have gotten a little bit more back to normal, crime has declined again. So over the last, from about 2022 to the present, uh, rates of violent crime have have decreased. Now, that doesn't mean that in some areas there's not, problems with ongoing violence, but overall, um, crime has been back on the decrease again. Now, the thing, of course, we have to remember that when you do crime victimization surveys, that is, if you ask people if they've been a victim of a certain crime, there's many, many more reports of victimization than there are of actual arrests for a crime. And there's a variety of reasons why people don't report it. It may be that they have their own solutions to it. It may be that they are cynical. I mean, if someone breaks into my house, what are the real odds that the police are going to catch them? Pretty small. And so why did I even bother to report it? I mean, I had a theft from my house several years ago. I couldn't
Mm-hmm.
prove who did it. What good is it to report to police? It's just going to be a waste of my time. And so people may feel that the police are either not going to respond or their response is not going to be effective. And in fact, the data show that uh, among reported crimes, there's an even smaller number of actual arrests for reported crimes. Uh, the sentencing project has this kind of funnel that goes from victimization to arrest to actual, to reporting to actual arrests and then to actual convictions. And the number of people convicted of crimes, of course, is much smaller than what is reported in victimization. So uh, you kind of realize that most of the crime that occurs out there is probably never reported. Um, and so you have to be careful when you talk about reported crimes. What are the impacts of people's motivation to report, as well as what how the criminal legal system actually responds to those reports? Um, Now, of course, uh, you saw in the 90s, you saw a rapid increase in incarceration, and that was somewhat correlated with a decrease in crime. And according to the Sentencing Project, some studies have found perhaps some relationship between increased incarceration and crime reduction, but they find statistically it's a very weak relationship. And the other thing that happened, of course, is as crime continued to decrease, incarceration continued to go up. So at a certain point, the increase in incarceration was not related to
To the
the
crime.
actual control of criminal behavior, because that was decreasing. So there's a weak relationship between incarceration and public safety. It doesn't beyond a certain point, it does not really improve or contribute to public safety in the way that a lot of people claim. Um, Now, there's two ways that prison populations increase. One, you put more people in jail or in prison. Two, you keep them there longer. Those are the two main drivers. So if more people are being put in prison, that obviously increases it. If the people that are put in prison stay longer, then obviously that's going to increase your prison population.
Mhm.
Well, the research on enhanced sentences, where you increase the penalty for a certain offense, say from 10 to 20 years or whatever, shows that increasing penalties is not a deterrent crime. It simply does not. People that are incarcerated for longer are not less likely to recommit. As a matter of fact, they may be actually more likely to recidivate because they're out of society for many years and don't really know how to cope after they get out. Um, and so increasing criminal penalties, increasing sentencing for things is simply not an effective approach to preventing crime, because it does incapacitate the people for a certain period of time. That's true, but it doesn't. Overall, it's not an effective approach. Um, and and of course, a big reason for that is if I'm going to commit a crime, chances are I believe it's because I won't get caught. That's most, I think most people that commit crimes are in the assumption, in the hope that they won't get caught when they commit the crime. And so if I say, if I'm going to commit an armed robbery and you increase the penalty from 10 to 20 years, since I don't think I'm going to get the penalty anyway, how does increasing the penalty from 10 to 20 years affect my decision to actually commit the crime? And it's true, most people don't get caught. I mean, the clearance rates for most crimes are strikingly low. I mean, if you commit a murder, you only got about a 50-50 chance of actually being arrested for it. And so to say that increasing sentences deters criminal behavior is simply not accurate. It doesn't work that way. Of course, also people commit crimes because their mental faculties are not working. They're addicted to drugs. They're desperate to get more drugs, uh, or they have mental health issues that cause them to commit crimes, and so they're not rational actors when they decide, uh, maybe on the spur of the moment, to rob somebody or to uh, carry out a domestic assault or whatever it is. And so to say that just simply increasing penalties is a deterrent to crime is not accurate. Now, the other thing I want to emphasize is that since 2010, nationally, we have substantially decreased our prison population. The prison population peaked in about 2010. And since then, about at least about a 20% reduction in the number of people incarcerated. That's not true in Iowa, but it's true nationally, okay? So uh, naturally, people are going to say, well, if you decrease incarceration, you're going to increase crime. Well, the Sentencing Project looked at a state by state comparison of the decrease in the number of people imprisoned and the increase or decrease in crime. And the interesting thing was that in some ways it was almost the opposite of what you'd expect. The states that the largest decreases in incarceration were also the states with the largest decreases in crime. And some of the states, like Iowa, which has had almost no decrease in incarceration, had some of the largest increases in crime. So to argue that decreases in incarceration lead to increases in crime simply has no basis in reality.
Right. Yeah.
So it's simply, and you see, in order to say that that's true, you have to argue that the people that were let out of prison were then the ones that went on to commit more crime. When in fact, yeah, there is pretty high recidivism for a number of crimes, but you'd have to argue that any increase in crime was caused by people that were being let out of prison. And that causal link just can't be met in most cases. And the same way with bail reform. I mean, actually, a number of states had gone in a direction of trying to revise the bail system, which is basically holding people in jail because they're poor, primarily. Um, uh, it, they were trying to blame bail reform for increases in crime. Well, they don't offer data to show that the people that were let out on bail are actually the ones committing the crimes, because that doesn't hold water. In some cases, of course, somebody that's out on bail may commit another crime. We know that it happens. And maybe a certain percentage of them who are out on bail instead of in jail will commit another crime. That's particularly if they're addicted to drugs and stuff like that, which, obviously if you don't deal with the addiction problem, you're not gonna solve the problem. Um, and so I think the efforts to roll back bail reform or even to, defeat progressive prosecutors who don't bust everybody for marijuana possession and so forth. Um, it's just the causal relationship between those efforts and any increases in crime that occur. It's just not there for the most part. It's just not there. So I think the attacks on criminal justice reform are really based on emotion, on I mean, violent crimes create strong emotions in all of us. We see one of these school shootings. It's just an innocent kids and teachers getting killed. It it elicits a very strong response of concern and anger and grief at what this is happening. Uh, and so those emotions are there to be played on by people that want to go back and start putting more people in jail, even though the idea that putting more people in jail will solve this problem is not there. Now, of course, what do you say? What's the alternative? Well, there are a lot of alternatives to imprisoning people. And there are various community-based solutions that have been shown to not actually uh, reduce the likelihood of future criminal behavior. Because what happens when you get put in jail? Well, let's just say you get put in jail, not prison. Well, first off, you probably lose your job. You lose income. You're not able to support your family. Your life is disrupted in important ways, and so uh, that may actually increase your likelihood of resorting to criminal behavior if you're eventually let out. Uh, but so alternatives that provide consequences if you did something wrong, but don't necessarily totally disrupt the lives of the individual or their families, seem to work better. Clearly, mental health is a big issue in crime. Our prisons are our largest mental health institutions. If we don't have services that address the mental health issues, and admittedly, it's complicated. I was reading an article about these mass shooters. Most of them displayed serious mental health problems before, identified mental health problems before they engaged in the shooting. So how do you intervene uh, and deal with those mental health problems before somebody decides to take a gun and start killing innocent people with it? It's
Yes.
hard because there's a gray areas about when and how you intervene, but it's necessary because you know the people that carry out mass shootings, they usually they're suicidal. They're going to kill themselves most of the time, as well as whoever else they kill. So increasing prison sentences from obviously doesn't work because they're ready to accept the consequences of what they did, whether it's by shooting themselves or just being arrested. And so that's not going to work. And so we have to figure out a way to increase our ability to intervene in mental health problems that contribute either to that kind of thing, which fortunately are still fairly rare, even though they're publicized, uh, and to other mental health problems that might contribute to other kinds of violent behavior like domestic assault and so forth. Um, so we need to have solutions that don't involve putting people in jail or prison. We need to have solutions that focus on the underlying problems. Drug addiction, of course, it is a contributor to criminal behavior because you have to get the money to support your habit. Well, the whole war on drugs, we spent billions and put millions of people in prison, and drug use stayed about the same. So you can argue that the whole war on drugs was a failure in
Mm-hmm.
reducing drug use because the levels of drug use before we started mass incarceration in the war on drugs are essentially similar to the levels of drug use that we find uh, uh, after 30 years of the war on drugs. So obviously, incarceration is not a solution to drug problems. Treatment, that sort of thing is obviously uh, another thing about crime is what really controls crime is a community working together.
Mm-hmm.
There was a study done a number of years ago by a criminologist named Robert Sampson, and he compared Chicago neighborhoods. And he took neighborhoods that were equally disadvantaged, okay, in terms of race, income, and so forth. He
Mm-hmm.
found that the the neighborhoods that had more community cohesion, more collective responsibility for action, had lower crime rates
Mm-hmm.
than comparable neighborhoods that didn't have that.
Mm-hmm.
And that a strong identification with neighborhoods and a strong willingness to work to improve your neighborhood really had more of an impact on crime than anything else. And uh, so that was a clear evidence across. I mean, he did several hundred Chicago neighborhoods. It wasn't a small sample, and then he called it collective efficacy. That was his term for it. The sense that people uh, get together to control what's going on in their neighborhood. So strengthening neighborhoods instead of
Hmm.
weakening them by harassing people, which is what the police do for minor infractions, uh, is the best way to go on that. Now it's hard. I mean, I've been involved in neighborhood organization, and it's not easy. It's a challenge to get people involved, to get them motivated, to get them to uh, work to control antisocial behavior in their neighborhoods. It's really hard, but
Hmm.
it's absolutely necessary. Um, I guess that's about all I have to say on this, unless you have other questions, Sue.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. That's very informative. What, if you could speak for just a minute about the three strikes and Clinton's hardcore treatment of crimes and of criminal behavior, and also of the super predator attitude,
Okay.
that what that did to crime and what that did to the population of African Americans.
Well, we have a sociological phenomenon known as moral panic, really, seriously, where people get
I know.
emotionally activated by things that happen, and it
Mhm.
creates a general feeling of danger, of the need to respond. And a lot of our response on criminal behavior is because certain events, certain things um, create a sense of moral panic in the population. Now, um, of course, in the 80s, you had the growth of crack cocaine, and that did result in more criminal behavior because drug markets have to sort themselves out by violence because there's no legal way they can get recourse
Mhm.
from their contractors, basically. So, and of course, you had certain well-publicized cases of of death due to drug abuse, like the Len Bias case, the basketball player. And
Mhm.
so this generated a lot of moral panic around drug abuse and the relationship of crime. And so that led to large increases in sentencing for possession and for distribution of drugs. Um, then, and of course, a lot of this has a racial bias to it. I mean, we're going to get morally panicked about people that are different from us, okay? Um, and then, um, and so that then, and that kind of, then of course, Democrats uh, developed an image and a reputation that they were soft on crime. They were being accused by their opponents that the Democrats were permissive and soft on crime. So a lot of Democratic politicians felt that they had to correct that. They had to re-engage the white middle class by saying that they're not soft on crime. So in states that were led by Democrats, there's some of the largest increases in sentencing and incarceration.
Mhm.
And because they were trying to prove that they were tough on crime. And that was what the atmosphere that led to the passage of the Crime Control Act that was in '94 under President Clinton. Um, and so that need to respond to some image that's been put out there that you're soft on crime motivated, uh, I think, things like the crime bill, which did result in a marked increase in incarceration after the mid '90s. That was a big boost in the incarceration trend. Um, Another thing, of course, that was an object of moral panic was the so-called crack babies. That
Mhm.
mothers addicted to crime were giving birth to babies that were addicted to crack. Well, you know, middle class people like to think that poor people are having too many babies anyway, but that's just a reserved trope that all these lower class people are just even though birth rates for poor people are about the same as for anybody else, it doesn't that doesn't deter people from thinking that. Well, turned out that, of course, um, there are some instances in where babies are born. It's not entirely unreal. I mean, there are some cases where an addicted mother will give a birth to a baby that's addicted to drugs from the get-go. But it turned out when they really analyzed all the data on that, it's very rare for that to happen. Very rare. And yet this fueled racial stereotypes because naturally, in the public mind, when you think of giving birth to a crack baby, unfortunately, images of black mothers on
Mm-hmm.
welfare pop into your head. And so, even though the racial element in it wasn't really there, the whole thing was exaggerated. And it was really a negative racial stereotype that was being uh, uh, attributed to mothers of color. Also, the whole super predator image that you talked about. Um, of course, it's very upsetting when a juvenile commits a violent crime. It's very upsetting. I mean, this kid that murdered those four people was 14 years old for crying out loud. Okay, so um, it's upsetting to think of youth committing violent acts, and they do commit violent acts.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, a lot of them are on themselves, you know, but but um, so the image that there were these predominantly black youth
Right.
prowling their neighborhoods and were incorrigible. You know, we had a juvenile court system before that treated juvenile crime as something that had to be treated differently from adult crime because these are people without fully formed ability
Mm-hmm.
to make choices to understand the consequences of their behavior. And so the juvenile system was set up to reflect in part the notion that juveniles are really different from adults. And so, but now that the super predator model was coming out, it was saying that, well, these youth are just incorrigible. They're so committed to violence that they'll never change them. Their behavior will never change. So the only solution to it is lock them up. And so that really fueled, and of course it fueled um, the transfer of juveniles into adult court,
Mm-hmm.
which, you know, putting a juvenile in an adult prison is not a solution to anything. It creates problems. Um, and and so it fueled this sense of, well, these violent, uncontrollable juveniles are out there. Well, it turns out again that you really look at the data and it's just a myth. I mean, it's not totally unreal. I'm not saying that. It's just exaggerated, wildly exaggerated. Now, of course, there are certain cultures within lower income communities that can breed tit for tat violence, where someone commits a violent act against you, or you're afraid they're going to commit a violent act against you, and so you retaliate or you respond by trying to committing a violent act of your own to as a means of protecting yourself. And that's a reality in some low-income communities. We can't deny that. But you know what? Some of the most effective responses to those kinds of situations are violence intervention programs where
Mm-hmm.
you try to work with youth and get them to develop methods of dealing with their conflicts and to prevent escalation of a conflict. Some of these violent acts can result from seemingly trivial, insults or thefts. I mean, they're just and but you have to intervene to try to get the youth to figure out different ways to solve their conflicts and also to get collective action where youth that are bystanders are engaged in helping to de-escalate rather than escalate situations. And that is a more effective response to these cycles of violence that do occur in in some communities.
And just to add to that, with the super predator, it's really interesting to me. We have not heard white middle class children who do violent crime called predators,
No,
super predators, or incorrigible or unredeemable at all.
no.
Um, it was basically restricted to, like you say, poor people, and the majority of the people that were labeled with that are people of color, kids of color,
Yeah, well,
which goes all the way back to.
we stereotype,
Mhm,
black neighborhoods as violent places. I've had people
right.
I've had people in Cedar Falls tell me that they're afraid to go to Waterloo. Well, I mean, come on. Waterloo has crime and there's shootings and so forth, but generally Waterloo has a crime rate that would be the envy of many communities in the country. You're not going to walk to East Waterloo and get shot. I mean, that's just not going to happen. I mean, it happens occasionally, but you know, and yet it's a stereotype. And people
Uh-huh.
may not even realize how race-based that stereotype is, that
Yes.
Waterloo is this dangerous place, and students at you and I are told by their small town white people, don't go to Waterloo, it's
Don't
scary.
go to
Right?
Waterloo.
I
That's
mean,
right. I don't want you to get shot.
it's it's such an obvious racial stereotype because Waterloo has a fairly large black population, uh, and yet those are the kinds of perceptions that persist, and it's it's unfortunate, but um, and, and
Yes.
I mean, I'm not saying there are not problems of violence in those areas. There are, but and a
But there
lot
are
of people
problems of
do.
violence in every area.
Right, yeah.
And there
Um,
are different kinds of violence. I mean, white collar crime has a flavor of violence when you come to how it ruins people's lives.
yeah. Well, and that gets into another thing, the fear of crime. Okay.
Yeah.
Uh,
Right.
Fear of crime is only tangentially related to actual crime.
Right.
Okay. Because the people's fear of crime doesn't necessarily correlate with their actual probability of victimization. For
Hmm.
example, old people like myself, okay, we we studies show that we fear crime more than other people. And yet, when it comes to things like violent crime, we're actually less likely to be the victim of violent crime than younger people.
Than young people.
Now, of course, the kind of crime we are vulnerable to is fraud.
Exactly.
There,
And
there's a
identity theft.
real
Yeah.
probability of people taking advantage of declining mental acuity to commit fraud.
Hmm.
But but our fear of crime sometimes doesn't correlate with the actual crimes that we're actually going to be victimized by. I mean, the computer fraud is rampant, and it's
Right.
very difficult to catch people at it. Very difficult.
Almost impossible to catch
All right,
people.
and so uh, and and that's what older people need to worry about, not getting mugged,
Right.
because
Right.
you know. So anyway.
Yes. So yes, I totally agree. I mean, there's so many different angles to this, and it's very complex, and a lot of it comes down to belief systems about cultures, different cultures, people who are different than Caucasian Europeans get the short end of the stick in this country over and over and over and over again.
Well,
Those go
when
ahead.
the system when this there are numerous decision points in the criminal legal system, from the decision of who to stop, who to arrest, who to
Hmm.
charge, what crime to charge them with, what kind of penalties to impose, and starting with the schools, it seems that routinely, if the choice is between a less severe and a more severe punishment, people of color are channeled towards the more severe
Right.
punishment. And
Right.
of course, the problem is it escalates. So if
Right.
if I'm convicted of a small crime when I'm younger, and then I'm accused of another crime, that's going to change the way that my other crime is treated because now I'm a repeater. So there's this cumulative effect of harsher decisions being made. I mean, look at school suspensions. They're way racially biased.
Exactly.
And the damn school resource officers just make it worse in most cases.
Mhm.
And 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 so bias even in school suspensions and expulsions then can lead to juveniles being further and further enmeshed in the system, which can then contribute to them getting enmeshed as adults and ending up in prison. So it's the impact of racism is just really frustrating.
Huge, very and huge. Well, and it go and along with what you were saying, the way that people are treated when they're stopped by a police officer varies greatly
Sure,
based on your skin color.
exactly. Uh,
I mean, it just
and
does.
of course, cops want to be seen as preventing crime. Okay, they want to be seen as effective.
I think there also, in
And
this day and age, there's some fear among
right,
policemen
right.
when they're
And
coming up on a car or coming up
so
on a house. I
sure.
mean, they're quick to overreact.
So what do you do? I mean, actually, your clearance rates for big crimes are not that great. Okay, really, and it's hard to solve big crimes, you know, uh, in many cases. And so, what do? You to make create an image of effective police force, you harass people for less serious stuff. And with black people, you start off a car of black teenagers and you start out with the assumption that they probably got drugs in there or doing
They're
something
up to no good.
up there no good. Exactly. Particularly if they're in a white neighborhood. Oh my God. You know,
Right. Right.
uh, again, I've heard people in Waterloo say they're afraid to come to Cedar Falls, black people, because of the way the
We'll
police
get arrested. Yeah.
treat black people. But that's another reverse fear that happens.
Exactly, exactly. So,
Anyway,
I mean, it is a major problem that we at IJAN will continue to explore and continue to inform the public about.
okay.
And this whole thing about crime is really important. I mean, it's very important. The way that we view crime and the way that we treat criminals in our culture really lays groundwork for a lot more problems than it solves, in a synopsis of the whole thing, I would say.
Right.
So, well, thank you as always. Thank you very much. It's been informative, and I think that we will get some good feedback.
Also,
So once again, I'm Sue Hutchins, and I would love to hear from you. If you have any comments, if you agree with what we're saying, if you disagree with what's being said, if you just want to comment, this really is for public education. That's the purpose. I can be reached at Iowa Prison Perspectives at gmail.com. That's IA Prison Perspectives at gmail.com. And once again, I thank you very much for listening and hope that you will continue to listen and subscribe and give feedback and let us know what your thoughts are so that we can continue to be useful and helpful and inform you and meet the needs of the public. So I will say goodbye for now, and I will see you later this week. Thank you very much for joining.